How the Dead Sea Scrolls creation stories differ from Genesis. Adam and Eve, the 7 days, a voice from the darkness. We all know the story of creation from the book of Genesis. For centuries, it's been the story, the one most of us could probably recite from memory. But what if I told you that back in the time of Jesus, this wasn't the only story being told? What if other, radically different versions of creation were circulating at the exact same time? It all starts in 1947. In desolate caves overlooking the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd chasing a stray goat stumbled upon clay jars that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Inside were ancient scrolls. These Dead Sea Scrolls wouldn't just offer a new chapter in history. They'd reveal that the story of creation we thought we knew was only one piece of a much bigger, more complicated puzzle. And these differences challenge everything we assume about the Bible. Section 1. The Foundation. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? So, before we get into the texts themselves, let's get the lay of the land. The Dead Sea Scrolls are basically a lost library, nearly 1,000 ancient Jewish manuscripts discovered in caves near an old settlement called Qumran. Dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, they're over 1,000 years older than our previous oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible. And this wasn't just a collection of Bibles. It was a snapshot of Jewish life during a vibrant, messy, and fascinating time. Inside those jars were biblical books, sure, but also commentaries, legal documents, calendars, and writings that were totally unique to the community that lived there. So who were these people? The leading theory, though it's still debated, points to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes. They were a devout, disciplined group who had split from the mainstream religious authorities in Jerusalem. They saw themselves as the true, faithful remnant of Israel, living a communal life out in the desert. And here's the crucial part. They weren't just passively copying scripture. They were active interpreters, editors, and even authors who believed they had a license to clarify, expand, and even rewrite sacred texts. They saw themselves as partners with God in an ongoing revelation, and that belief is the key to understanding why their creation stories look so different. Section 2. The Authorized Version. The Genesis Creation Story. To really get why the Qumran Scrolls are such a big deal, we need a baseline. The creation story we're all familiar with. This is the version from the Masoretic text, the meticulously preserved Hebrew Bible that became the standard for Rabbinic Judaism and most Christian Old Testaments. Funnily enough, the book of Genesis actually gives you 2 creation stories for the price of 1. Genesis 1 is the majestic cosmic poem. Over 7 days, God brings order from chaos. Let there be light. And bam, there's light. It's grand, orderly, and distant. Then, Genesis 2 zooms in for a close-up. It's a much more intimate, hands-on story. God gets his hands dirty, forming Adam from dust, breathing life into his nostrils, planting a garden, and then creating Eve from Adam's rib. Together, these 2 accounts form the foundational creation story for billions. For centuries, this was assumed to be the single, unchanging account. But the caves at Qumran were holding a secret that told a much more complex story. Section 3. The Revelation. The creation stories in the scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't just offer one single alternative creation story. Instead, they reveal a whole spectrum of variations, rewrites, and brand new ideas. First, you have actual manuscripts of Genesis that show the text wasn't set in stone yet. While the Genesis fragments found at Qumran are very similar to the standard text, they contain small but significant variants, a different word choice here, an alternate spelling there. These tell us that different manuscript traditions of Genesis were circulating, and the Qumran community was preserving versions that were slightly different from the one that would later become the standard. But where it gets really wild is in what scholars call the rewritten Bible. These aren't just copies with minor typos. They are entirely new works that retell the Genesis story, often with blockbuster changes. The most famous is the Book of Jubilees. Copies of this book were found all over the Qumran caves, which tells us it was a bestseller for the community. Jubilees, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis, reframes the entire biblical narrative according to a strict solar calendar of 49-year cycles, or jubilees. Creation isn't just a one-off event. It's the start of a divine timetable that the community had to follow perfectly. Jubilees also fills in the gaps. Remember in Genesis 1:26 when God says, "Let us make man in our image"? It's always been a bit ambiguous. Jubilees solves it. It explicitly says angels were created on day one, and God is speaking to his divine counsel. Problem solved. Then there's the Takar Genesis Apocryphon, an Aramaic scroll that's basically a first-person retelling of the lives of figures like Noah and Abraham. It adds new dialogue, inner thoughts, and motivations. For example, it gives Abraham a prophetic dream to justify his sketchy decision to tell the Egyptians that his wife Sarai was his sister. It's a change that completely reframes the ethics of the original story. But perhaps the biggest bombshell of all wasn't in a rewrite, but in a totally new theological framework. The community rule, a sort of handbook for the Qumran sect, introduces a radical idea you won't find in Genesis: cosmic dualism. In a section called the Treatise on the Two Spirits, the text explains that at the moment of creation, God made two opposing spirits to govern humanity: a prince of light and an angel of darkness. Every person lives under the rule of one or the other. History isn't just God's plan unfolding. It's an all-out war between light and darkness, truth and lies. This idea, that good and evil were set in motion as opposing forces at creation, is a massive departure from the vision of Genesis, where one God is the source of everything. This text also introduces a heavy dose of predestination, stating that God decided from the beginning who would walk in light and who would walk in darkness. If you're digging this deep dive into hidden history, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm we're unearthing cool stuff and helps us make more videos just like this. Now, back to the scrolls. Section 4, the why, explaining the differences. So, why all these changes? Were the scribes at Qumran just bad at copying? Not a chance. The evidence shows these changes were features, not bugs. They were entirely intentional. For the Qumran community, Scripture wasn't a static, dusty book. It was alive. They believed revelation was ongoing, and that they had the authority to edit and expand the texts to reveal their true, hidden meaning. If a passage in Genesis seemed vague, they'd clarify it. If a story felt incomplete, they'd add a few scenes. Many changes were also theological power moves. The obsession with the solar calendar in the Book of Jubilees, for instance, was a direct shot at the lunar calendar used by the temple priests in Jerusalem. By writing their calendar into the creation story itself, they were making a bold claim. Our way is the original way, ordained by God from the very beginning. Likewise, the dualism in the community rule perfectly explained the world as they saw it, a cosmic struggle between their righteous community, the sons of light, and their enemies, the sons of darkness. They reimagined the story of creation to validate their own experience and justify their unique, isolated way of life. Section 5, the big picture, what this means for our understanding of the Bible. The discovery of these alternative stories completely upends the idea of a single, perfectly preserved Bible handed down unchanged through the generations. Instead, the Dead Sea Scrolls open a window onto a time of incredible textual pluriformity, a fancy term for an era when multiple different and competing versions of the biblical books all existed at the same time. The scrolls let us see the Hebrew Bible before it was standardized. Before the Masoretic text was chosen as the final authoritative version, there were other contenders in the ring. The Qumran community preserved texts that ultimately fell out of favor and were lost to history for 2 millennia. Now, this doesn't mean the Genesis we have today is wrong. What it shows is that the Bible as we know it is the product of choices. In the centuries after the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, Jewish leaders had to decide which texts were in, which were out, and which versions were the right ones. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the library of a Judaism that, in a sense, didn't win that debate. but they provide an invaluable snapshot of the theological creativity that defined this pivotal period of history. From tiny textual variants to epic rewrites like the Book of Jubilees, and on to game-changing theology like the dualistic war of the community rule, the Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the story of creation wasn't set in stone. It was a living, breathing narrative, constantly being shaped and reshaped by people trying to make sense of God and their world. They show us a time when Scripture was still being written, and Genesis was not an end, but a starting point for even more revelation. So how does knowing that multiple creation stories were floating around in ancient Judaism change how you see the Bible? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you want to explore another ancient text that was beloved at Qumran but didn't make it into the Bible, check out our video on the mysterious Book of Enoch. Thanks for watching.